Thank you everybody for being here. I'm really excited to present this paper, which is going to be about international migration responses to natural disasters in the Philippines and how surge frictions and congestions in the international overseas labor markets is going to affect the migration response to these shocks. The starting point of this paper is that households, especially in developing countries, cope with shocks through a variety of strategies, such as informal credit, intra-household transfers, saving and then liquidating assets, etc. But these strategies can break down when shocks are aggregate for a locality. So the entire risk-sharing network, in a way, can be affected by the shock. Such shocks can be natural disasters, which is going to be the focus of this paper, but they can also be epidemics, recessions, etc. And in the context of such covariate aggregate shocks, international migration can, at least theoretically, facilitate coping with such shocks because of the geographical distance between the origin and the destination of the migrants. The idea is that even if a shock is aggregate for the origin, the destination country may be unaffected by the shock. And this coping can happen through remittances increasing from already existent migrants, or the focus of this paper is going to be new migration taking place in response to a shock. Of course, the effectiveness of international migration on dealing with shocks depends on the structure of the market, right? Specifically, the frictions that are underlying the migration market, because we all know that variety of frictions impede international migration, like policy barriers, liquidity constraints, etc., that may actually impede a migration response. So when we're studying the question of international migration responses to shocks, it is important to consider the frictions underlying the migration corridor that is being studied. My focus today is going to be on a specific type of migration, temporary international labor migration, which is an exceedingly common form of migration, especially in low-income countries in South and Southeast Asia. From 12 countries that I could find data on, for example, there's over 4.5 migrants annually leaving these countries with this type of migration. And for smaller countries like Nepal or Sri Lanka, like relatively smaller countries, these annual outflows can be as high as 2% of their working age population. The key feature of this type of migration is that it requires securing an overseas contract prior to migrating and leaving the home country, which is usually done through private intermediaries, private recruitment agencies. Two things about this market is, first, it's been previously shown that the number of willing migrants at the prevailing overseas jobs can actually exceed the amount of overseas jobs available. So there can be excess migrant supply at the given overseas prices. In the context of excess migrant supply, it is not clear whether a shock, even though it may increase intentions to migrate, whether it's going to actually increase and create additional migration. Second, this type of migration is usually people find jobs through decentralized search between many migrants and many private intermediaries. And this friction can be exposed to significant search frictions because the first intermediary I go to may not have a job available for me. The second one, then I have to go to a second intermediary, etc. So it is not immediate that I can immediately find an overseas job. More importantly, or equally importantly, I guess, this process is also contingent on the availability of overseas contracts. So the size of the migration response may also vary over time, depending on the migrant demand conditions, depending the availability of these overseas jobs when a negative shock hits. So in this paper, I'm going to be asking the question, the broad question, can international labor migration be an effective shock coping strategy? And I will particularly have an eye out for how do surge frictions and possible excess migrant supply shape the migration outcomes in response to a shock, and whether international migrant demand conditions influence and mediate this migration response. The context that I'm going to be studying is going to be the impact of typhoons on international labor migration from the Philippines. And what's going to allow me to do this analysis is that I have administrative data that covers the universe of new migrant contracts leaving the Philippines. This data not only allows me to look at migrant flows, but I also have information on migrants' wages, which occupation and destination countries they're going to. So this is going to allow me to paint a more complete picture of the migration response, where I'm going to not only look at migrant flows, but also going to look at how shocks change the characteristics of migrant contracts, such as the migrant wages. The key variation I'm going to use, first of all, typhoons are going to provide me with time-varying variation in returns to migration, because typhoons are going to negatively affect origin economic activity. And second, I'm going to use spatial variation within the Philippines about which municipalities tend to send people to which destination countries. And therefore, there's going to be spatial variation in exposure to the destination shocks. There's going to be spatial variation in exposure to GDP shocks to different destinations within the country, which is going to give me the variation in migrant demand conditions to answer the question of whether international migrant demand conditions influence the migration response. Before moving on, I want to give a quick preview of the results so you know what is to come. First, I'm going to show that typhoons do indeed lead to increased international migration. I'm going to have a continuous measure of typhoons that I'm going to describe later, but a 1 standard deviation typhoon exposure is going to lead about a 4% increase in the migration rate of a Philippine municipality for up to 3 years. And my estimates will suggest that on a given year, on average, there are 10,000 additional migrants leaving the Philippines due to typhoons, and about $134 million of additional migrant income in response to typhoons. However, while typhoons increased international migration, typhoon-induced migrants overwhelmingly go to lower paying occupations and countries, right? So I'm going to find that for each % increase in the migration, the average migrant cohort wages are going to be falling by about 0.3%. And I'm going to interpret this result through falling reservation wages in the presence of search frictions is going to essentially decrease the reservation wages of migrants and induce them to accept overseas jobs that maybe they wouldn't accept in the absence of an origin shock. This migrant earnings response leads to about a $30 million drop in the migrant income response to typhoons, which is about 22% of the total migrant income response to typhoons. So this is a substantial drop. I will then show that better migrant demand conditions, so positive GDP shocks to the destination countries I usually send migrants to, is going to actually lead to a larger migration response to typhoon and a relatively smaller drop in average migrant cohort wages. Specifically, I'll show that the migrant earnings response to a typhoon is almost 2.3 times larger during 80th percentile demand conditions compared to the median that a municipality faces at the time of a shock. And finally, I'm going to use household survey data to show that this new migration response, can plausibly make up a significant portion of the total remittance response to migrant origin provinces as well. And consistent with the migration results, the remittance response is also going to be higher during better demand conditions. This paper primarily contributes to 3 literatures. Most directly, it contributes to the literature on international migration responses to shocks. And my key contributions here is going to be, first, I'll focus on a relatively understudied but important type of migration in this context, temporary international labor migration. And I'm going to document some relative novel impacts on, for example, occupation and destination choice of migrants in response to shocks, and contingency on the migration response to migrant destination conditions. Second, this paper more broadly relates to the literature on international migration frictions. And in this paper, I'm going to show empirical evidence consistent with the idea that there are search frictions and excess supply in international labor markets when it comes to international labor migration. And finally, this paper is related to the recent empirical literature on international migration and propagation of shocks. And I'm going to show in this country that one way shocks can propagate is that destination country GDP conditions, economic conditions, actually influence the shock coping ability of migrant origin countries. So I'll start with a little bit more about the context. So international labor migration in the Philippines is a very large scale. And according to 2015 census, for example, about 7.5% of households have an overseas labor migrant member. And about 90% of legal migrant outflows out of the Philippines is actually through this temporary labor migration channel. In this figure, I'm showing the annual migrant outflows for the two main legal ways to leave the Philippines. In the blue lines, I show the temporary labor migration that is going to be the focus of this paper. And the red bars are out migration through permanent visas. For example, if I'm migrating to the US through some sort of family migration or something. And the takeaway message from this figure is that temporary labor migration makes up the vast majority of migrant outflows out of the Philippines, and therefore is important to study in trying to understand the migration responses to typhoons. With this type of migration, migrants travel alone without their families for 1 to 3 year contracts, and they have to return to their origin country if they cannot renew their contract at the end of the contract period. And from the Philippines, migrants leave for a wide variety of destination countries and occupations. In my data, there's over 150 destinations, but vast majority of the migrants are going to be leaving for Gulf countries like UAE or Saudi Arabia and other developed countries in Asia, such as Hong Kong or Japan. And the top occupations that I see in the data is domestic helpers, production workers, nurses, waiters, bartenders, etc. The important key point here is that majority of the migration is for low or semi-skilled occupations. So this is not high-skilled out migration, like, for example, computer scientists out of India or something. And the wages are going to vary significantly, of course, given the wide variety of destination countries and occupations. Wages are going to be varying with occupations and countries as well, where about the 75% of the wage variation in the data is explained by which country I'm going to and which occupation that I'm leaving for. Wages are regulated by both the Philippines government. So, for example, there's different binding minimum wage floors for different occupations in the migrant markets. And also they're subject to destination country laws. So you cannot, for example, leave for a country and then be paid below the minimum wage of the country. Similarly, there are bilateral agreements sometimes between Philippines governments and overseas destination countries that essentially set a lower bound for migrant wages. So in the short run, especially, the ability of wages to move downwards is pretty limited. And finally, in this context, there's evidence of both excess supply of migrants and search frictions. For example, there's a 2022 survey which suggests 17% of adult Filipinos aspire to work abroad through these contracts, and 7% report that they're actively searching. While obviously every year, 7% of adult Filipino population is not migrating out. So this is consistent with the idea that there is significant congestion and possibly excess supply of migrants in these markets. And even in the presence of these excess supply of migrants, the Philippines Overseas Employment Agency reports that there are unfilled vacancies every year, which is consistent with the idea that there are search frictions which lead to there being both excess supply, but also unclaimed overseas vacancies. So in this context, what data do I have for migration? As I mentioned in the intro, I have administrative data from the Philippines Overseas Employment Agency that covers the universe of new migrant contracts where people are going to foreign destination countries. This data excludes seafarers. And for each migrant, I know their municipality of origin, their contract salary, the destination country occupation, and basic demographics like sex and age. I have the data on the municipality of origin for 2 periods. For 2007 to 2016, this is going to be my analysis period, so all the results are going to be using this period. And 1992 to 1997, which for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be calling the baseline period. And anytime I say I'm calculating something using baseline data, it's going to be referring to this baseline period of 92 to 97. Overall, I have approximately 4 million contracts in the analysis period. And then I create a municipality year level panel that is covering the 10 years between 2007 and 16 for all about 1,600 Filipino municipalities. I complement this data with other data sources. Three that is going to show up in this presentation is to understand the education level of migrants. I used 100% census microdata to get data on the education level of the stock of migrants. And also, I have data on survey on overseas Filipinos are going to give me the education of new migrants. I also use the family income and expenditure surveys, which is a household survey, to study the impacts on remittances. So that's the migration side. On the typhoon exposure side, I construct an exposure index using meteorological data from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. And I take into account the intensity of typhoons, the number of typhoons in a given year, and whether they're hitting populated areas or not to create this typhoon index. And the right panel here shows the municipality level typhoon exposure index from 2003 to 2018. Typhoons, as this figure will suggest, typhoons are very common in the Philippines. And in my analysis period, essentially almost the entirety of the country has been hit by a typhoon at one period or another. Given that this measure is something I construct from meteorological data, it is important to validate it somehow to make sure that I'm actually capturing a meaningful measure of typhoon exposure. So to do this, I got province level typhoon damages data from the Filipino government. And the data set not only has damages on like the pecuniary damages due to typhoons, but also the number of affected people and the total casualties. And these figures are basically showing a bin scatter between all these three outcomes: damages, number of affected people, and the total casualties due to typhoon. And basically, it seems like my typhoon exposure index does a good job in predicting these typhoon casualties and damages, which gives me confidence that this is a meaningful measure of migration. In the paper, I also showed that increased typhoon exposure leads to lower night lights, which again suggests that the typhoon exposure measure is capturing something meaningful. So armed with these migration and typhoon measures, I'll first focus on the average migration impact of typhoons. The empirical strategy I'm going to use is going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be a fixed effect strategy, where the Y here is an outcome in municipality M in time T. And then I'm going to be regressing this on the typhoon index, that is the average typhoon exposure in the year of interest and the previous year, to summarize the impacts on what I will call the short run. That's what BSR stands for. And then I'm going to have the migration exposure to the average migration exposure 2 to 3 years before. And this is going to be estimating the impacts in the medium run. And then I have the usual fixed effects, the municipality fixed effects to control for any time invariant differences between municipalities. And then I have a time by island group fixed effect to the Philippines is divided to 3 major island groups. And this fixed effect ensures that I'm not capturing any time trends related to migration that is for the different island groups. The important thing to note here is that my identification strategy does not just compare high typhoon exposure to low typhoon exposure municipalities, because that would be problematic in the sense that I would just be comparing the north of the country to the south, because the north has way more typhoon exposure. But instead, this identification strategy utilizes the randomness in the exact timing, location, and intensity of typhoons, conditional on fixed municipality characteristics. In other words, the identifying assumption here is that whether a municipality is hit by an above or below average typhoon exposure in a given year, conditional on year-end municipality fixed effects, is uncorrelated with other migration outcomes. Which makes sense because, let alone, it's hard enough to predict typhoon, like the intensity of typhoon seasons at all, let alone predicting the individual path of individual typhoons in a given time period. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I also, for the main outcome, will also show like a more granular event study estimation to show the time path and show that there's no problematic pre-trends. So let me start first then with the migration response to typhoons. This figure shows the migration rate response per 10,000 to a 1 standard deviation typhoon exposure. And basically, there's a pretty, about 2 quarters after typhoon exposure, there is a migration response that lasts for about 15 quarters and then dies down. And using the summary measure that I've just shown you in the previous slide, so the coefficients on the short run and the medium run summary measures suggest that a 1 standard deviation typhoon exposure increases the migration rate per 10,000 by 1.2 people in the short run, which is about 3.7 of baseline migration rate, average migration rate, and about 4 to 4.3% in the medium run. These numbers suggest that there is about 10,000 additional annual migrants due to typhoon exposure in the Philippines. So first of all, this result suggests 2 things. First of all, in the literature, we know that usually when we're thinking about like natural disaster response to typhoons, there are the competing forces of disasters tend to increase barriers to migration and worsen liquidity constraints, which might decrease migration, but also increases returns to migration. And in this context, it seems like increases in the returns to migration is dominating, and we're actually seeing a positive migration response. And the excess migrant supply is not so binding that even though typhoons may lead to more people wanting to migrate, we are actually seeing a migration response. It is actually translating into a migration response. While the migration is increasing in response to typhoons, in this figure, I show results from 4 regressions where the outcome variable is the wages of migrant cohorts, where I'm showing you the results for the mean wages and then sort of different quartiles of the wage distribution. So while migration increases in response to typhoons, the wages of migrant cohorts following typhoons are lower. For example, looking at the average, a 1 standard deviation typhoon exposure leads to about a 1% decrease in the average wages of the new migrant cohorts following typhoons. So the question here, of course, is what is driving this? What are the mechanisms behind it? So in the following slides, because the wage response is the strongest in the short run, which is this blue line here, a blue bar here, I'm going to show results for the short run where we're seeing the wage drop to be the strongest. First, what I do is I group occupations and countries using baseline migration data. I group occupations and countries into wage quartiles. Basically, what I do is I regress the wages on fixed effects for occupation and country jointly, and then back out the fixed effect estimates, and then create wage quartiles where the first quartile, for example, means the lowest wage countries and occupations, while the 4th quartile means the highest wage occupations and countries. With countries, you can think that the lowest wage countries tends to be the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, while the highest wage countries tend to be Canada and Japan. What this figure here shows is the same regression as before, but the outcome variable is the percent of migrants leaving for each country or occupation quartile. And the pattern that you see here basically suggests that after typhoon exposure, the share of migrants leaving for lowest paying countries and occupations increase. So there's a difference in the composition of destination countries and occupations of migrants following typhoons. Of course, the question here then is how much of the wage response is attributable to this drop in, to this like occupation and country downgrading. And the table on the right here shows that basically all of the wage drop is explained by the country and occupation choices of migrants. The first column here, I regress the individual migrant contracts on the typhoon exposure, and consistent with what I've shown you before, there's about a 1% drop in migrant wages in response to a 1 standard deviation typhoon exposure. However, if I control for the predicted wages of the migrants, only using information about which countries and destinations they're going for, and only using information from the baseline period, so none of these estimates are affected by the typhoons that are in my analysis period. Basically, once I control for this predicted wage, the entire wage response goes away, suggesting that the drop in wages are driven by the occupation and country choices of migrants. I interpret this result in the paper through the help of a model as, given we know that there's like significant search frictions in this context, when a typhoon hits and the origin utility or economic conditions deteriorate, migrants now have possibly a lower reservation wage for migration. So maybe now they're willing to accept overseas jobs that they were not willing to accept before, which are for lower paying countries or occupations, or they may actually direct their search towards lower paying countries where the probability of finding a job is higher. At this point, of course, a big issue is selection, because I've just given you this story about migrant wages dropping due to falling reservation wages. But in this context, what I'm looking at really is a cross-section of new migrant contracts. So because it's a cross-section, selection might be operational. Maybe what's happening is that the marginal migrant is negatively selected. And it's not that there's a reservation wage story. It's all coming through the fact that the marginal migrant is willing to leave, can only take lower paying jobs. To deal with this, first, I look at what data I have available in the contract data, which is, as far as demographics go, is age and gender. And in the paper, I do show that typhoons do lead to about a 0.2% drop in average migrant ages. So the cohorts following typhoons are very slightly younger, though this effect is fairly small. And there's no significant effect on the gender composition of migrants. Importantly, if I control for the age and gender of the migrants and do the analysis that I've shown you before, essentially the wage results are unchanged. So age and gender doesn't seem to be driving these results. Using the census and the survey data, I can further look at whether the educational attainment of typhoons in response to migrants change. And both using the survey data that shows me the educational attainment of new migrants, and looking at the census data on the stock of migrants, I show in the paper that if anything, typhoons increase the educational attainment of new migrant contracts. So instead of a negative selection, there seems to be positive selection. And this is readily rationalizable by the idea that in response to a negative home earning shock, usually it is the less liquidity constraint that can respond to these shocks, especially if the liquidity constraints are worsened. And given more educated individuals usually tend to be wealthier, one way to rationalize this result is to note that in response to a typhoon, the more educated and less liquidity constrained people may be more able to migrate in response to a typhoon. What is important here to understand the story that I'm trying to tell is that if anything, in the presence of positive selection, we would have expected the migrants to have higher wages, not lower, in response to a typhoon. So the fact that we're actually seeing lower wages, even though the educational attainment of migrants increase, seems to suggest that, again, selection is not driving this result. Finally, a quick, more theoretical point. If we think that people have heterogeneous home utility, and therefore, not every Filipino is uniform in how much they want to stay home. If a typhoon makes people more likely to migrate, the marginal migrant has to be a person who, on average, has higher home utility. In a way, they're more tied to home. So again, even like when we're looking at this context, if the marginal migrant is more attached to staying at home, we would also, again, expect the marginal migrant to have higher reservation of wages abroad, not lower, which again goes to the direction of negative selection is likely not driving these results. I want to quickly point out. Oh,
just to inform you, you have 10 minutes left.
I have 10 minutes left? Oh, wow. Okay, I'm going to have to be much faster. Sorry. I'm going to skip this. Basically, in the paper, I also talk about whether these patterns are unexplainable, like why do we need the search frictions? Doesn't just like an Econ 101 competitive market story explain this result. But I show some patterns in the paper to suggest that these results are not driven by responses at the destination wages, or it doesn't seem like there are unclaimed jobs at the lower end of the wage distribution that people are just like more likely to take in response to a shock, which again sort of works with the idea that it seems like in the presence of search frictions, people are decreasing their reservation wages. So overall, the results I've shown you so far suggest that there is a migration response to typhoons, but there are also substantial decreases in migrant income due to frictions, due to the lowering of the destination and country choices of the migrants. For each 1% increase in migration due to typhoons, there seems to be about a 0.3% drop in the mean and a 0.4% drop in the median migrant wages. So these are the average responses. Now I'm going to move to, given the importance of the availability of these overseas contracts in response to shocks, how does the international migrant demand conditions that a municipality faces in response to shocks is affecting the results? To measure the role of migrant demand conditions, I first use migrant demand shocks to destination countries. And in the paper, I showed that the migrant demand shocks to destination countries increases the Philippine migration to a destination without a strong wage response. And I interpret this essentially as GDP shocks shift the availability of overseas jobs for potential migrants at home. I take these destination shocks, and to bring them back to the municipality level, I use the variation in exposure to different destination countries by looking at baseline migrant shares from each municipality to a destination country. This figure, for example, shows that the north of the country sends significantly more people to Hong Kong, so we would expect them to be more exposed to shocks at Hong Kong, while the south of the country here is much more exposed to Kuwait. And importantly, these baseline migrant shares are persistent. So this figure shows that the baseline migration shares and the analysis period migration shares are very highly correlated, which is in line with what we know about the migration literature, where these networks tend to be persistent over time. I create, using these components, a shift share style proxy for municipality year level demand, for like a municipality year level demand conditions facing a municipality. And the key identification assumption here is that time variation in a destination country's GDP is as good as random from an individual Philippine municipality's migration decisions. So destination GDP, essentially destination GDPs are not, driven by migration choices of an individual Philippines municipality or something. I would like to go more into this, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Armed with this demand index, D, and typhoon, and the typhoon exposure that I've already shown you before, I'm now interested in whether the migration responses to typhoons are heterogeneous in the contemporaneous demand conditions facing a municipality. This is basically very similar to the estimating equation I've shown you before, but with this heterogeneity term. And in the paper, I follow the randomization inference procedure of Bolerberg and Hall, given that this empirical setup can be seen as a non-random exposure to random shocks literature. But in the paper, I'm not going to get into that. In the presentation, I'm not going to get into it right now. So what do we find? This figure shows the one standard deviation, like the migration response to one standard deviation shock, but it traces out the migration response across the migrant demand index. And there's a very steep increase, suggesting that when a municipality is facing better migrant demand conditions, the migration response is much larger. For example, at the 20th percentile, there's essentially no migration response, while when we move all the way to the 80th percentile, the migration response in response to a typhoon is about 6.7%. Second, the second figure traces out the drop in migrant wages for each percent increase in migration due to a typhoon. And what this figure shows that when demand conditions are better, the relative drop in average migrant wages are also lower as well. So not only do we see a bigger migration response, but also the drop in migrant wages relative to the migration response is smaller. Combining these two things, I basically find that the migrant earning response to typhoons is almost 2.3 times larger in the 80th percentile demand conditions compared to the median, both because of the lower migration wage drop and the bigger migration response. It seems like some of this drop, one reason the migrant wages are not falling as strongly is due to the fact that the occupational downgrading, the pressure to downgrade occupations in response to a shock, is less so when the migrant demand conditions are better. So when a shock hits, if the demand conditions facing a region is better, I see lower occupational downgrading, which partially explains some of why we don't see a large migration, larger wage drop when the demand conditions are better. So overall, these results suggest that the migration response depends on the state of the international migrant demand, which affects availability of overseas jobs. And it also raises one caution about dependence on contemporaneous demand conditions should suggest caution when we're generalizing from one individual event or a disaster. Because if the event that we're studying out of luck corresponds to a time of exceedingly high or low migrant demand, we may get estimates that do not have a lot of external validity. In the last 2 minutes, let me quickly go through the remittance results, though I won't have time to get into them. What motivates this remittance results is that a key reason people migrate is to support origin networks through remittances. And while I show you the new migration response, you may be asking, all right, but are new migrants a drop in the bucket compared to the overall remittance response to origins? So I try to understand, A, whether there is a remittance response, B, how much of this remittance response can be attributable to new migration. So using the household survey data, first, I do find that in the short run, there's about a 6.7% increase in household per capita remittances. So there is a remittance response to shocks. And consistent with the migration results, this remittance response is larger when again, the region of interest is facing better migrant demand conditions. So just like the migrant earnings response is larger in response to shocks, so is the remittance response at home, which gives us reason to believe that new migration is important because the migrant demand conditions abroad should primarily be changing how many new migrants are leaving in response to a typhoon. Though there's some wrinkles, but that's not 100% correct, but that is at least suggested. So finally, what I do in the paper is that I use a back of the envelope method to combine my remittance estimates with the migrant migration rate and migrant earnings estimates, and use two strategies to just try to back out realistically what share of the total remittance response in response to typhoons is reasonably attributable to new migration. I do this using both levels and then percent changes. Both of them require me to make different assumptions. That's why I make it these two different ways. I'm not really going to go into the details of how this is done, but both results suggest basically that about 15 to 20% of the total remittance response to shocks can be plausibly attributed to the new migration response in response to typhoons, which suggests that this new migration response is not only important for households that can now have access to migrations because maybe they didn't have a migrant member before, they have one. But not only are they important at the household level for the households that send migrants, but also at the aggregate level, they make up a meaningful share of the total remittance response. At least they can. So to conclude, in this paper, I show that temporary labor migration can offer shock coping gains. However, surge fictions in this market seems to incentivize migrants to leave for lower paying contracts in response to shock. And then there's substantial response heterogeneity by migrant demand conditions at time of a shock. So any policy that is done by the Philippines, for example, that increases the availability of overseas contracts in response to a shock can potentially have pretty large shock coping gains for origin regions that are hit by a natural disaster. And these results are particularly relevant given that we are expecting the frequency of climate-induced extreme weather events to increase over time. And more, there's some emphasis globally on selective migration with more restrictive policies for low and semi-skilled migrants, but limiting the migration opportunities for low and semi-skilled migrants can have significant implications for how much a given region can deal with negative shocks. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I'm sorry I rushed there a little bit at the end.
No, perfect. You are right on time. Thank you very much, Emir, for this presentation. I will now let 5 to 10 minutes to Rim to discuss this paper. before going to the open session for questions. Rim, the floor is yours. You can share your screen. Yes, perfect. We can see that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Emir. This was a very clear presentation. So I will start with a short summary. 1 second, let me move the... Okay, so a very quick summary, but the presentation was already clear, so this will be a bit repetitive. The big picture of the question behind the paper is that temporary labor migration responses can mitigate negative origin shocks, and that's what's basically talked about in the literature when we talk about migration. So the question in this paper is whether that actually happens and how does it happen if it does happen. So the specific research question is, what is the impact of typhoons on temporary international labor migration, specifically in the setting of the Philippines? And Emir looks at different mediators in a theoretical model that looks at congestion, surge frictions, and importantly, international migrant demand. So in terms of data, he uses a couple of administrative and survey data. I found particularly impressive the administrative data, which is provided by new migrant contracts, the universe of these contracts, which also includes information on wages, the duration of the migration, the destination where the migrants end up in, and the occupation. For methodology, Emir uses a fixed effect model exploiting within municipality variation in typhoon exposure, which is random in intensity and location. So the results show that when there's an increase in typhoon exposure, that leads to an increase in temporary outmigration in both the short and the medium run. But that also is accompanied with a destination and occupation downgrading, which decreases the reservation wages of migrants. However, when there is better migrant demand conditions at the destination, that mitigates the wage responses because now there is lower occupation downgrading. And then the last set of results is that there's also an increase in remittances by these new migrants. So in terms of comments, I found that this is a very thorough paper, so I invite everyone to read it. It was very interesting and well written and clear, so the flow of ideas is very clear. The question is pretty important given that there is increasing natural disasters now with all the climate change and the public debate about climate migration. So Emir did a lot of robustness checks. Every analysis was accompanied with many checks. And I found the findings to be pretty interesting and policy relevant. In a nutshell, they show that migration is an important coping mechanism to those affected by climate shocks, and it could provide capital or chance for reconstruction through increased remittances. So my first comment concerns identification. So the main identification strategy hinges on the randomness of typhoons in terms of intensity and location. Although there is not a dummy variable that shows treated or not, but we can think of it as earlier or later treated municipalities are not selectively different. And figure 1, which was also shown in the presentation, shows that there is considerable geographic variation in typhoon exposure within the country. However, I was thinking that since the time period spans 10 years, what is the likelihood that the same municipalities are being affected by typhoons more than once within this time period? So the idea here is that could earlier treated municipalities or those that are highly exposed to the typhoon measure, could they implement any mitigation policies that could affect the outcomes, but at the same time affect the influence the response to future typhoons, which I think could be a problem given the heterogeneity in the effects within this 10-year period. So I also thought that you could show differences in the characteristics between the municipalities with high versus low exposure. These could be local characteristics or differences in specifically migration between these municipalities. Then the second comment considers the persistent effects on migration. And I found that to be particularly very interesting, that the effects are not only within the first year after the typhoon, but they persist for 2 or 3 years. However, the effects on wages are not persistent, which is understandable. I thought that you could put more emphasis on this in the paper. And also a bit of discussion of why would this be the case. So the migration effects persist for 2-3 years, and then they become larger, but why is that? So the first stage analysis, which you also showed in the presentation, shows that typhoons lead to damages and destruction in the municipality. So I was thinking, are these effects persistent over time as well, which would explain the persistent effect on migration? Or is it just a network effect where migration experiences are spread through family networks, and then there's this self-reinforcing effect on migration? So I thought, since this is a very interesting result, a bit of discussion of why you think this is happening would complement your analysis. And then finally, on the effect on remittances, I thought it is interesting why remittances are not increasing in the median run, despite that wages are recovering and there is a continued rise in migration. So a bit of explanation on why that would be happening would be nice. And the last thing is just a possible extension. So I thought that given this increase in remittances, it would be also nice to, in probably a different project, to estimate the effect of remittances on household outcomes, whether education or whether future migration, that would also maybe explain the persistent migration effect in the medium run. So overall, this is a great paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and yeah, I hope it goes to great places.
Thank you very much for this discussion, Emir. If you want to react very quickly to a few points, you can, but then we will go to the open discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Reem, for the discussion. It was very helpful. I take your point about the identification point, where overall you're right that certain municipalities are hit by multiple typhoons and everything. It's precisely because I am in an empirical context where you have repeated exposure and also continuous measure and sort of like not a staggered adoption, but basically shocks at different times. I can't exactly use the two-way fixed effect literature has come up with estimates that can deal with these things, but to the best of my knowledge, not with the setting that I have with all these complications. But in the paper, I do show that like a binarized version of this two-way fixed effect estimator follows the stacked by event estimation strategy of Cengiz et al., for example, pretty closely, which decreases my concerns about whether there is bias coming from the fact that heterogeneous treatment effects. And one reason I think why heterogeneous treatment effects are not operational in the setting is because at a given year, in expectations, the probability that any given region is going to be hit by an above average typhoon is sort of the same. So the migration cohorts shouldn't, in expectation, have heterogeneous treatment responses. And therefore, that mitigates a lot of the concern about this heterogeneous treatment effect literature. Sorry, I don't want to, you had made a lot of great points. I don't want to take all the time to respond to them, but thank you. And if you can send me the slides, I'd be very happy.
Thank you very much, Emir. So now we have more or less 10 minutes for questions. Simone, you have been waiting for a long time. Please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Melchior. And sorry, I realized that I had unmuted while I was coughing. So really, I'm really sorry about this. So great paper, Emir. I have a couple of comments and a question. So let me start with the question. I think that you're very convincing to show that the results on migrant wages are not driven by negative selections increasing when a municipality is hit by a typhoon. But sorry, I'm just wondering which are the municipalities where migrants are actually, in a sense, downgrading their destination choice when a typhoon hit. Are these the municipalities where tough luck, there are there's a low demand for migrant labor in the main destinations when the typhoon arrives? Or I just have a hard time, because in the figure that you showed, if I understood it correctly, you don't observe a positive effect on the number of outgoing migrants if demand shocks are not in the right end of the distribution. So I'm not understanding this. And the second thing that came to my mind is, if I understand correctly, if you have two municipalities that send, the municipality A is sending all of its migrants to just one single destination, and municipality B is sending all of its migrants to two destinations, and demand conditions are identical in these countries, the demand shock is the same for municipality A and for municipality B. But I would like to see whether the responsiveness of outgoing flows, and in particular the choice of the destination, is larger for a municipality where past flows were more diversified, in a sense that people do not know a priori what is the right destination. And so maybe they would be more willing to invest in information acquisition to overcome the frictions that you have in mind, in a sense, because it's not obvious. Okay, it's if the destination choice is not obvious, maybe, and you could expect a different reactivity with respect to typhoons and to conditions at destination. But that was a super clear presentation in 40 minutes, and excellent project.
Thank you. So to your second question, I mean, comment/question, I guess, you're absolutely right that your understanding is correct. In my setup, the situation you described, you would have the same demand conditions. So I think you're right that I can definitely conditional on the demand conditions as I've defined them, whether there is actually a differential response by, in a way, how diversified the portfolio of countries I have is an analysis I can definitely dive more deeper into, and I haven't done that yet. So thank you. That's a great comment. And your first question, sorry, I focused on the second question too much and already sort of forgot the specifics of it. But I think your understanding was correct, that I'm essentially showing that if the demand conditions are bad enough, in a way, maybe, there isn't a lot of migrant overseas contracts flowing around when a typhoon hits. I'm essentially finding that there doesn't seem to be much of a migration response. Interestingly, there's still actually a downgrading, but that sort of makes sense, because if my reservation wages fall, my reservation wages fall. And so maybe I am still like taking some job at the margin that I would otherwise not take, because the option value of searching has changed. So I don't want to keep searching. I just want to go. But the results do seem to suggest lower demand conditions at the extremes. You get pretty close to zero. I think there's more work to be done there. How much of that is driven by just this linear specification, and maybe in a non-linear way, it doesn't immediately go to zero. So I definitely do think that specifying the model a specific way sort of almost forces things to be linear and go to zero. So I will think more about that. Thank you.
Andrea, please go.
Yeah, great paper, great presentation. I just have a question about the positive selection that you show. I was interested in seeing did you actually show directly that the more educated migrants do have the similar behavior, they switch to similar destination countries? Because the story about search frictions makes sense, but I was wondering, highly skilled or highly educated migrants tend to have lower search frictions in general. They tend to rely on migrant networks less than low-skilled migrants. So that if you show directly that you can also, your story about the competition as well with the low-skilled migrants makes more sense. So,
yeah. No, that's a great question. That's why I keep using the word suggestive when I'm talking about that part, because one limitation is the data that shows me where people are going, etc., is not the data that shows education. I have to bring in additional data. So I unfortunately can, it would be really interesting to see, look, more educated migrants are maybe going to lower paying countries or whatever. Unfortunately, I don't really see that. So the best I can do is I saw this positive selection, and given what I know about the literature, I can think of a couple of stories that explains it, but it's really hard to nail down what is exactly happening. There is US labor literature that shows that during recessions, high educated people start being more and more like start working at coffee shops and stuff, right? And the idea is I don't want to be unemployed, so I'm going to downgrade and I'm going to start searching for jobs maybe I wouldn't otherwise have. And now lower wage workers are competing with college educated workers for these lower wage jobs. Like a situation like that in my mind is not entirely implausible. Like maybe in the past I didn't want to work construction in Saudi Arabia, but now I'm willing, so I'm congesting that market. But I mean, your point is well taken. It's really hard for me to exactly pin down what if I did, life would be so much better.
Thank you. I think that we have the time for a last question. If anyone's, yeah, Felix.
No, Simone, please.
We have time for two. No problem.
Okay, I was wondering if you see why and when contracts ended, and I'm thinking a bit if you can try to measure whether they kind of catched a bad employer to get the downgrading also at the employer level.
Yeah, I don't see the employer in most of the, like the data doesn't tell me who the employer is. At best, for a couple of years, I see the recruitment agency.
Yeah, what I was wondering if you can see whether contracts end early or like whether they end for certain reasons, these kind of things.
I can't. I can tell you that the contract length increases a little bit in response to typhoons, but the effect is pretty small. Maybe it's because now I'm more willing to leave for 3 years than before. But what I can't see, which would be great to see, is if I'm abroad and I renew my contract, I don't go through Philippines again. So I don't know who's renewing their contract. I think a lot of this migration response may also be, there's a whole bunch of people in Saudi Arabia working. Maybe some of them are renewing their contracts in response, right? Because they don't want to come home. They want to support family at home. Unfortunately, that part of the market is not visible in this data. But yeah, your point is definitely right. It would be cool if I could see whether contracts are cut early or something so that I can say something about selection, maybe like less or worse workers are now going abroad in response to that. I can't, unfortunately.
Simone, if you have the last questions.
Yeah, so another remark that came to my mind, Emir. So if migrants' wages are endogenous with respect to migration, so they decline after a typhoon, then one should expect possibly diversion effects across origins, so across municipalities in the Philippines, in the sense that if municipality A is hit by a typhoon when other municipalities that send their migrants to the same destination are also hit, then the migration response in municipality A should be lower. So in a sense, I was wondering whether you have thought about building a measure of similarities of destination choice, and then do what you have done for the destinations in terms of typhoon conditions elsewhere in the Philippines.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. I think it's Appendix D.3 or something. I start thinking about stuff like that. I mean, the way I started thinking about it is that I think is a big concern in the sense that it's a SUTVA violation. Like I'm really taking my microestimate seriously, but if I'm just taking migrants away from other municipalities, but the aggregate number of jobs are fixed, I should actually start worrying like, look, sure, jobs are now allocated to places that need it. So there might be a welfare gain, but maybe there's no aggregate migration response. So in the paper, I do something actually very similar to what you just described, where using the baseline data, I create like a similarity index of like migrant destination origins. And then I now have a weighted shock based on how similar the regions are and everything. There's a lot of econometric concerns because that also means usually we're closer. Like those similarity is probably correlated with a whole bunch of other stuff, like whether we're close or we're hit by the same typhoon, whatever. Doing the best I can, controlling for these things, I don't find a diversion effect. Like there doesn't seem to be, my migration is lower if regions that have similar destination networks to me is hit by a typhoon. So I don't see a negative effect. I tried it in multiple ways. At some points, I actually find like a positive effect, not very strong. But the reason it's in the appendix is I think I am not 100% convinced. I've dealt with all the possible limited variables that I can think of. Like, I think it's really hard to take that thing as causal 100%. So what I'm mostly doing is alleviating concerns about diversion, but that's sort of it.
Okay, but maybe what part of the answer could also be in your group of islands times here fixed effect. So if similarity is mostly within those fixed effects, then that is absorbed.
Yeah, it is not entirely. So it's not. It doesn't absorb all of it, but you're right. It absorbs a reasonable portion of it. I mean, I've shown the shares figures, right? And like the north usually just goes to Hong Kong. The year by island fixed effect is in there. Thank you, though. That's a great one.